The night Caleb Mercer lost everything, the sky didn't care. It just kept snowing. He stood 30 feet from his burning cabin, his daughter screaming into his shoulder, his son too cold and too shocked to make a sound. 8 years of his life turned to black smoke against a Wyoming winter sky. The fire was almost beautiful. That was the worst part. By morning, he would knock on 11 doors in Black Hollow. 11. And every single one would close in his face. The lamp had been Eleanor's lamp, a delicate glass thing she'd brought all the way from Pennsylvania, wrapped in wool at the bottom of her trunk. He'd hung it for her that first summer, the summer after he finished building the cabin, the summer after he buried her in the rocky soil behind the property. For 8 years that lamp had hung in the same spot, until the wind came down from the north with no mercy in it, and the corroded wire finally gave way. The tool shed was all they had, 60 yards from the cabin, downslope toward the tree line. Caleb pulled everything into a pile in the center of the shed floor, a tarp, rough burlap grain sacks, a narrow-mouthed clay jug with half an inch of oil in the bottom. He wrapped Noah in the tarp. The boy was shaking badly now, the adrenaline wearing off and the real cold coming on. He draped 3 grain sacks over Lila's shoulders and drew her in against his left side and pressed Noah to his right. "I'm cold," Noah said. His voice was very small. "I know, son. Hold on to me." "Papa?" Lila said after a long time. Her voice carried that particular careful quality she used when she was past afraid. "What are we going to do?" Caleb stared at the dark ceiling of the shed. The honest answer was that he didn't know. The honest answer was that they had nothing. No food, no money, no shelter, no tools. Nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever raw capability he could pull together in the next 24 hours.
"Tomorrow morning," he said, "we go to Black Hollow." "Do we know anyone there?" "Not really." She was quiet for a moment, digesting this. "Will they help us?" Caleb thought of the town, the trading post, the livery, the handful of homesteads scattered around the settlement's edge. He knew some of those people by name. He'd sold timber to some of them. They knew him as a capable man, a steady man, a man who kept to himself and met his obligations and didn't create problems. Whether any of that translated to help, real help, shelter and food for a destitute man and 2 children help, was a different question entirely. "Somebody will," he said. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. They left the tool shed at first light. Caleb carried Noah on his back for most of the 3-mile walk to Black Hollow. The boy was too cold and too spent to manage the pace on his own. Lila walked beside him without complaint, though he could see in the set of her jaw what the effort was costing her. The settlement came into view around mid-morning. Smoke was rising from a dozen chimneys. The sight of it, the ordinary, unearned warmth of other people's fires, hit Caleb somewhere in the center of his chest with a force that surprised him. He shifted Noah's weight on his back and kept walking. The first door belonged to Amos Fletcher. The door closed, then the second, then the third. By the 5th house, Noah had stopped shivering. That was worse, actually. The shivering was at least a sign that the boy's body was fighting. By the 10th house, Caleb stood in the snow outside the 10th closed door and felt something happen inside him that wasn't grief and wasn't anger and wasn't despair exactly, but was some cold amalgam of all 3. "Papa?" Lila said. Her voice was very careful. "There's one more house." He looked where she was pointing. A small cabin set slightly apart from the others, back toward the southern tree line. Modest, neatly kept, with a cord of firewood stacked along its north wall,
and smoke rising in a thin, steady line from its chimney. He almost didn't knock. That was the truth of it. After 10 doors, 10 polite or impolite refusals, the simple act of raising his fist to knock on a door had been freighted with something humiliating and terrible. But Noah was too still on his back, and Lila was watching him with those 2 old eyes. So he knocked. The door opened. If this story is reaching you, if you're feeling what Caleb felt standing on that threshold with his children and nothing else, then you understand why stories like this matter. They remind us that in a world of closed doors, it only takes one open door to change everything. Hit that like button if you're still with me. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one. Stories about the moments that break us and the moments that remake us. And I want to share every single one of them with you. Now, let's go back to that doorway. To the woman with flour on her hands. To the moment everything changed. "I had a fire last night," Caleb said. He heard how flat his voice was. The flatness of a man who has explained himself too many times in too few hours. "We lost everything. I've been to every house in this settlement asking for shelter. Nobody." "What are the children's names?" she said. He blinked. Of all the responses he'd steeled himself for, that one hadn't been among them. "The girl is Lila. The boy is Noah." The woman looked at Noah's still face. She looked at Lila's raw, cold, chapped cheeks. She looked at Caleb. "Bring your children inside," she said. "My name is Mara Whitlock. There's a fire going, and I just put a pot of soup on." She stepped back from the door to let them in. Caleb stood on her threshold for one moment, just one. Unable, after everything the morning had been, to quite believe that it was real. That someone had simply opened a door and said, "Come in," without hesitation, without calculation, without the particular arithmetic of self-interest that had governed every other response he'd received that day. "Mr. Mercer," Mara said, not impatiently, just clearly. "It's cold." He stepped inside. The warmth hit him like something physical. After the hours in the cold, the night in the tool shed, the walk through the snow, the standing on frozen doorsteps, with rejection gathering like ice in his lungs, the warmth of Mara Whitlock's cabin was so immediate and so total that Noah, who had been ominously still for the last half-mile, stirred on his back and made a small sound. "Set him here," Mara said, moving to a low bench near the hearth and pulling a folded quilt from the chest beside it. "Close to the fire, not too close. We warm him gradual." Caleb eased Noah down onto the bench. The boy's eyes were open but glassy, watching the fire with the removed, drifting attention of a child at the edge of his resources. Mara wrapped the quilt around him with efficient, practiced hands, then turned to Lila. "Come here, sweetheart," she said, and held out her hand. Lila, who had not let anyone but Caleb touch her in years, who was privately fierce and publicly self-contained, looked at Mara's outstretched hand for a moment and then took it. Mara led her to the second bench by the fire, sat her down, pulled another quilt from the chest, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Then she went to the hearth, took the lid off the pot, stirred it, and looked over her shoulder at Caleb. "Sit down," she said. "You look like you're about to fall over." "I'm fine." "You've been carrying that boy for 3 miles in the cold after spending a night in God knows what
after watching your home burn down. Sit down, Mr. Mercer." He sat down. The soup was venison and root vegetables, thick and plain and very hot. She served the children first, large bowls which she set in their hands and wrapped their fingers around with a kind of deliberate, non-performing tenderness that Caleb found, in his depleted state, almost undoing. Noah drank more than ate, lifting the bowl to his lips and drinking the broth in long, slow pulls, the color coming back into his face by degrees. Lila ate with controlled, rapid efficiency, the eating of a hungry person trying not to appear hungry, and the sight of it, his 12-year-old daughter performing dignity in the middle of her worst morning, pressed on something in Caleb's chest that he had no language for. Mara set a bowl in front of Caleb and then sat across from him at the small wooden table and folded her hands and waited. "I don't know how to thank you," Caleb said. "You don't have to. Not right now. You didn't even ask what happened." "I could see what happened," she said simply. 3 people standing in the snow in no fit condition for the snow. The rest of it can wait." He looked at her across the table. She met his gaze without self-consciousness, without the quality of a person waiting to be praised for their own generosity. She was just present, direct, calm, specific. "I went to 10 houses first," he said. He wasn't sure why he told her that. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like the particular already knowing quality of someone being told something they'd already suspected. "I know most of those people," she said. "Then you know why?" "Yes," she said. "I do." She didn't offer anything further, and he didn't ask for it. Some things are understood between people who have both lived long enough on the edges of communities to know what communities will and won't do for people who need them. "We just need a few days," Caleb said. "I can work. I'm useful. I can cut wood, repair things, do whatever needs doing around here. I'll work for the shelter until I can figure out what comes next." "You can rest today," Mara said. "Your children do. They need a full day of warmth and sleep and food before anything else. And so do you, whether you'll admit it or not." That night, after the children were asleep, Noah on the low bench by the fire and Lila in the narrow sleeping loft above, Caleb and Mara sat at the table in the firelight. "Why did you let us in?" Caleb asked finally. Mara was quiet for a moment. "Because you were cold," she said. "And because no one else did, and because—" She paused, the way people do when they're deciding how honest to be. "Because I know what it is to be the person nobody opens the door for. And I decided a long time ago that if I ever had the chance, I would be the door." Here is the question that hung in the air of that small cabin, though neither of them spoke it aloud. What does it cost us to see another person's suffering and turn away? The 11 doors had already answered. They had chosen comfort over compassion, caution over courage. They had looked at a father and his freezing children and performed the particular mathematics of self-interest that allows good people to do nothing. But Mara Whitlock had chosen differently. Not because she was wealthy, she wasn't. Not because she had space to spare, she didn't. She chose differently because she understood something the others had forgotten. That the line between standing and falling is thinner than we like to believe. That any of us, in the wrong winter, with the wrong wind, could be the ones standing in the snow. Knocking, hoping, waiting for someone to remember what it means to be human. The first week was careful. That was the only word for it. 4 people learning to exist in a space built for one, each of them carrying their own particular wariness like a second skin.
Caleb woke before dawn every morning, a habit 20 years deep that no amount of exhaustion could break. He'd lie on the pallet by the hearth, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Mara's cabin. The way the wind hit the north wall differently than it had hit his own. The creak of the floorboards under her weight when she rose. The particular silence of a house where everyone is awake, but no one has yet spoken. He tried to be useful without being intrusive.
It was a difficult line to walk. He'd chop wood, but only after asking where she wanted it stacked. He'd check the animals, but only after learning how she preferred them fed. Every action required negotiation. Every gesture required permission. And the cumulative weight of asking, of not being the man in his own house, settled on him like stones. Mara, for her part, moved through her own space with the particular efficiency of someone who had arranged her world exactly as she needed it and was now navigating the disruption of that arrangement. She was not unkind, but she was precise. The woodpile went here, not there. The tools returned to this hook, not that one. The morning routine proceeded in this order, not another. "I'm not trying to be difficult," she said one morning, after Caleb had moved the water bucket from its usual spot and she'd moved it back. "I'm trying to maintain order in a situation that's already complicated enough." "I understand," Caleb said, and he did, though understanding didn't make it easier. They circled each other like this for days, polite, careful, each of them performing a version of themselves that required constant attention. It was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with the work of not taking up too much space in someone else's life. Lila watched it all with her two old eyes. She helped where she could, washing dishes, sweeping, tending the fire when Mara was occupied elsewhere. She was trying to make herself useful, Caleb understood, trying to justify their presence, trying to be good enough that maybe, just maybe, they could stay. Noah was quieter than usual. He sat by the window for long stretches, looking out at the snow, his small hands folded in his lap. The carved animals he'd loved were ash now. The routine of his life was ash. Everything familiar had been reduced to smoke and memory, and he was 8 years old, processing a loss he had no vocabulary for. It was Mara who saw it first. One afternoon, perhaps a week into their stay, she sat down beside Noah at the window bench with a block of soft pine and a short knife and set them in the space between them. Noah looked at the wood. "What's that for?" "Carving," Mara said. "Do you know how?" "My papa showed me a little." He paused. "He made me animals. They're gone now." "I know," she said. "I thought you might want to make your own." She showed him the basic technique, how to read the grain, how to angle the blade, how to think about what was inside the wood before you started taking pieces off it. She was patient and specific and didn't overhelp, which was exactly the right calibration for a boy who needed to feel capable rather than coddled. Within an hour, Noah was bent over the wood with his tongue between his teeth, the total absorption of a child who had found something to do with his hands that was also doing something with whatever was too large to fit in words. Caleb, watching from across the room, said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have made it smaller. But something in his chest, something that had been clenched since the fire, loosened fractionally. The crack came on the 9th day, and it came because of the fence. Caleb had been working on the north pasture fence since morning. 3 posts had heaved out of the ground during the last freeze, and if they weren't reset before the next thaw, the whole line would fail.
It was hard work, the ground half frozen and resistant, but it was work he knew how to do. Work that produced visible results. Work that made him feel, for the first time in days, like a man rather than a guest. He was driving the third post when he heard the sound behind him.
Mara was standing at the edge of the pasture, watching him. He hadn't heard her approach. "You're setting them too shallow," she said. Caleb stopped. The sledgehammer was heavy in his hands. "I've been setting fence posts for 20 years. "I'm sure you have, but this ground freezes deeper than whatever ground you were setting posts in before. If you don't go down another 6 inches, they'll heave again come spring." He looked at the post, at the hole he dug, at the frozen ground that would require another hour of hard labor to deepen the way she was suggesting. "I know what I'm doing," he said. "I'm not saying you don't know what you're doing in general. I'm saying you don't know this ground specifically. I've been setting posts in this pasture for 6 years. I know how deep they need to go." There was no anger in her voice, just that same direct, specific clarity she brought to everything. But something in Caleb, something that had been compressed by days of asking permission, of being corrected, of not being in charge of anything, including his own competence, finally pushed back. "I'm not your hired hand, Mrs. Whitlock. I'm a man trying to work off a debt. There's a difference." Mara went very still, the kind of stillness that meant something important was happening beneath the surface. "I know the difference," she said quietly. "Do you?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Caleb set down the sledgehammer. His hands were shaking, not from cold, but from something else. The particular fury of a proud man being made to feel small, mixed with the shame of knowing that she was right. About the posts, about the ground, about all of it. "I'm sorry," he said finally. The words cost him something. "Don't apologize for your pride," Mara said. "Just don't let it make you stupid." She walked back toward the cabin, leaving him standing in the half-frozen pasture with a fence post set too shallow and the clear understanding that he had just failed some test he hadn't known he was taking. He pulled the post back up, dug the hole deeper, 6 inches, just as she'd said. By the time he finished, his hands were raw and his shoulders were burning, and the light was failing. But the posts were set right. When he came back to the cabin that evening, Mara was at the stove. She didn't look up when he entered, but she spoke. "There's hot water in the basin. You'll want to wash before supper." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't coldness either. It was something in between, the particular careful neutrality of two people who had just discovered the shape of each other's boundaries and were now deciding what to do with that information. Caleb washed his hands in the basin. The water was hot, almost too hot, and it stung the raw places on his palms. He welcomed the pain. It felt honest. That night, after the children were asleep, Mara spoke again. "I'm not trying to make you feel small," she said. She was sitting at the table with her quilting, not looking at him. "But this is my home. I've kept it standing alone for 6 years, and I've done it by knowing every inch of this land and what it requires. If you're going to work here, you need to listen when I tell you how things are done. Not because I think you're incompetent, but because I know what I know." Caleb sat across from her. "You're right. About the posts, about the ground, about all of it." "I usually am," she said. And then, for the first time since they'd argued, she looked up at him. There was something in her eyes that wasn't anger. It was closer to recognition. But I could have said it better. You said it fine. I just didn't want to hear it. She went back to her quilting. The needle moved through the fabric with precise, even strokes. My husband used to have the same problem.
Thomas couldn't stand to be told he was doing something wrong, especially by a woman. We fought about it constantly those first few years. It was the first time she'd mentioned her husband without being asked. "What changed?" Caleb asked. "He fell through ice one winter. I pulled him out." She pulled the thread through, tied it off, cut it. "After that, he decided maybe I knew a thing or two about survival." Caleb looked at her, this woman who had opened her door to strangers, who knew her ground well enough to call his work insufficient, who had once pulled a drowning man from frozen water, and apparently done it without making a production of it. "I'll listen better," he said. "Good," Mara said, "because I'm not going to stop telling you when you're wrong. That's not how I'm built." "I wouldn't want you to," Caleb said, and meant it. Something shifted in the cabin that night. Not a thaw, exactly. The ice was still there, but there was a crack in it now, a place where the cold could begin, slowly and carefully, to give way to something else. February came to Wyoming with teeth. The kind of cold that made the trees crack like rifle shots in the night, that turned breath to ice crystals in the air, that required constant vigilance just to keep the animals alive. It was brutal, unforgiving weather. But inside Mara Whitlock's cabin, something unexpected was happening. They were becoming a household. It happened in small increments, barely noticeable until you stepped back and saw the accumulated change. The way Lila no longer asked before refilling the wood box. The way Noah set the table without being told. The way Caleb knew, without asking, that Mara took her coffee black in the morning and with a little honey in the evening. The way Mara had stopped saying, "my cabin," and started saying, "the cabin." The rhythms of their days developed an easy efficiency. Caleb rose before dawn to tend the fire and check the stock. Mara made breakfast while Lila helped, and Noah fed General, the goat who had become his particular charge, his daily confidant, his anchor to something that needed him. After breakfast, Caleb worked whatever project the season and the property required, while Mara managed the indoor work and the children's education. Because that was the other thing that had happened. Mara had begun teaching them. She hadn't announced it. She'd simply pulled out a slate one morning, set it in front of Lila, and said, "Show me your letters." Lila had looked at her father. Caleb had nodded. And just like that, school had begun. Mara taught the way she did everything, with direct, unsentimental efficiency. Reading, writing, arithmetic, all delivered in clear increments with immediate correction when they got something wrong and quiet acknowledgement when they got it right. But she also taught things Caleb couldn't have taught. How to identify medicinal plants, how to preserve food, how to read weather and animal behavior, how to manage a household's resources through a hard winter. "Why are you teaching us this?" Lila asked one afternoon, looking up from a particularly difficult arithmetic problem. Mara set down the shirt she was mending. "Because knowledge is the only thing no one can take from you. You can lose your house, your money, your land, but what you know, what you can do, that stays. And a woman who knows things, who can do things, doesn't have to depend on anyone's permission to survive." Lila held her gaze. "Is that why you're teaching me? So I don't need to depend on anyone? I'm teaching you so you can choose who you depend on.
There's a difference." It was the kind of answer that would stay with Lila for the rest of her life. The kind that would shape the woman she became. Noah's education was different, more practical, more kinetic.
Mara taught him to carve with increasing skill, but also to churn butter, to card wool, to understand that the work of survival had no gender attached to it, only necessity and competence. "My mama used to say boys shouldn't do kitchen work," Noah said one morning, elbow deep in bread dough. "Your mama lived in a different place with different rules," Mara said, not looking up from the onions she was chopping. "Out here, anyone who can work, works. Anyone who can contribute, contributes. Pride doesn't keep you warm in winter. Bread does." "I like bread," Noah said seriously. "Then keep kneading." Caleb, listening from the doorway where he was pulling on his coat, felt that strange tightening in his chest again. The tightening that came whenever he watched Mara with his children. Whenever he saw how easily they'd folded her into their lives, how naturally they sought her opinion, her approval, her presence. Eleanor had been warm, effusive, the kind of mother who spoke her love constantly and demonstrated it in 1,000 small, tender ways. Mara was different. Her love, and Caleb was beginning to understand that it was love, even if she'd never name it that, was practical, functional, expressed not through words, but through attention, through the teaching, through the feeding, through the particular way she anticipated their needs before they knew they had them. It was no less powerful for being unspoken. If anything, it was more so. The children bloomed under it. That was the only word. Noah's silences became less haunted, more contemplative. He smiled more easily, laughed more readily. The 8-year-old boy who had watched his home burn down was still there, still carried that loss, but he was no longer defined entirely by it. And Lila, God, Lila. She was becoming someone new, still serious, still careful, but with a new dimension, a confidence that hadn't been there before. She asked questions now without apologizing for them. She offered opinions without waiting for permission. She held Mara's gaze when they disagreed about something, which they did regularly, and argued her position with increasing skill. "You're stubborn," Mara said one afternoon, after a particularly spirited debate about the proper way to preserve venison. "You're stubborn too," Lila countered. "Yes, but I'm right." "This time," Lila said, and there was the smallest smile on her face. Mara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "You're going to be formidable, child. The world won't quite know what to do with you." "Good," Lila said. Caleb, watching this exchange from the table where he was repairing a harness, felt something close to awe. His daughter was finding her spine, and the woman who had given them shelter was giving her something more valuable than that. She was giving her permission to be strong. But it was the evenings that changed things most profoundly. After supper, after the dishes were done and the children were settled, there was an hour or two before bed when the work was finished and the fire was banked and there was nothing required except existence. In those hours, the 4 of them would sit in the main room, Mara with her quilting, Caleb with his whittling or his repairs, the children with their projects or their reading, and simply be. They talked sometimes, small things mostly, the day's events, plans for tomorrow, observations about the weather or the animals or the neighbors. But often they didn't talk at all. They just sat in the particular comfortable silence that develops between people who have learned to trust each other's presence. The kind of silence that isn't absence, but fullness.
The kind that says, I don't need to perform for you. I can just be. It was during one of these evenings, perhaps 6 weeks into their stay, that Noah asked the question.
"Miss Whitlock," he said, not looking up from the wooden horse he was carving, "do you have any children?"
The quilting in Mara's lap went still. A brief pause, 2 seconds, maybe 3. "No," she said. "Did you want any?" "Noah," Lila said sharply, with the preemptive horror of an older sibling whose younger one is about to commit a social catastrophe. "It's all right," Mara said. She looked at Noah. Her voice was even, but there was something careful underneath it. The particular care of someone handling something real. "Yes, I wanted children." "What happened?" "It didn't come to pass," she said. "Sometimes things don't, no matter how much you want them." Noah nodded, turning this over with the seriousness of a child processing genuinely significant information. "Well," he said after a moment, with the frank, complete simplicity of 8 years old, "we're here now." The silence that followed was perhaps 5 seconds long.
Mara looked at the boy with an expression that Caleb, watching from across the room, had never seen on her face before. All the directness was still there, and the steadiness, but underneath it something had given way. Not broken, nothing in Mara Whitlock broke easily, but opened, like a door. "Yes," she said. Her voice was the same, measured and clear, but something in it was different, as if she'd had to recalibrate from somewhere deeper than usual. "You are." Noah nodded, satisfied, and picked up his carving again. Lila shot her father a look, quick, questioning, a whole conversation contained in a glance. Caleb gave the smallest shake of his head. Not now. Let it be. Mara looked down at her quilting. She didn't do any stitching for a long moment, just held the fabric in her hands like it was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. That night, after the children were asleep, Mara spoke first. They'd been sitting in their usual silence, but this one was different, weighted with everything that had been said earlier and everything that hadn't. "He's a remarkable boy," she said, without looking up from the quilt she was working on. "Noah." "Yes." Caleb considered the fire. "He's got his mother's way of saying things straight out. No preamble, no apology." "She sounds like someone I would have liked," Mara said. The past tense applied naturally and correctly, with no discomfort. He appreciated it. "She was," he said. "You're alike in some ways. The directness, the way of not wasting things, time, effort, words." Mara was quiet for a moment. Her needle went through the quilt fabric and came back. "That's a kind way to put it," she said. "My brothers used to call it pig-headed." Brothers are required by nature to be wrong about their sisters. That got the edge of a smile. Quiet, real. "They were good men," she said. "All 3 of them." A pause. "They're gone now." Different years, different causes. That's frontier life. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "Don't be sorry. Be here." She said it without looking up, quickly, as if she hadn't quite meant to say it. Then she continued sewing, as if she hadn't. Caleb looked at her bent head in the firelight, at the precise, unhurried movement of her hands, at the woman who had opened a door without hesitation on the worst morning of his recent life, and who had, in the weeks since, revealed herself to be something he hadn't had the vocabulary for when he'd stood on her threshold. Something steady and sharp and quietly completely decent in the deepest sense of the word.
He thought about what it meant to be seen clearly by someone, not as your losses and your needs, not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed, but as a person, specific, capable, worthy of plain speech and shared silence and the honest company of an equal. He hadn't been seen that way by anyone in a long time.
"I should check the fire before I sleep," he said.
"I know," Mara said. "You always do." Outside, the Wyoming winter pressed on without apology, but the cabin was warm, and somewhere in the careful space between what had been said and what hadn't, something was growing, unnamed still, unacknowledged, but present, entirely, undeniably present. Gideon Voss arrived in Black Hollow on a Thursday morning in late January, which was, by any reasonable measure, the worst possible time of year to arrive anywhere in Wyoming. He came in a covered wagon that was too well appointed for the roads and pulled by horses that were too fine for the terrain. He wore a coat that cost more than most men in the settlement made in a season. He was perhaps 50, with the broad, settled look of a man who had spent decades being right about things and had allowed that track record to calcify into absolute certainty. His face was pleasant in the way that faces are pleasant when their owner has learned that pleasantness is more useful than honesty. His eyes were the flat, assessing gray of a man who looked at everything, land, buildings, people, and saw first and only what it might be worth to him. He established himself at the trading post with the confident ease of someone who understood that in small settlements, the man who buys drinks and speaks well and carries himself as though success were a permanent condition of his character tends to acquire very quickly whatever social leverage he needs. Caleb heard about him within 2 days. "Land buyer," said the man at the feed store with the tone of someone who hadn't decided yet whether that was good or bad news. "Out of Cheyenne. Says he's looking to consolidate some of the eastern parcels." "What for?" Caleb asked. The man shrugged. "Timber rights, maybe. Or holding, waiting for the territory to develop." Men like that, they don't always need a specific reason. They buy things because buying things is what they do. Caleb didn't think about it much beyond that. He had his own concerns. The building season was approaching, and with it, decisions that had been deferred by the convenient urgency of winter. Where would they live come spring? He'd been walking his land, assessing what could be salvaged, what would need to be rebuilt, making calculations that felt different now because they involved not just himself and his children, but the woman whose cabin had become, in ways he was only beginning to understand, the place where he most wanted to be. He was wrong about Voss having no bearing on him. He understood that when Mara came home from the trading post one afternoon with a particular stillness in her face that he'd learned to recognize as the expression she wore when something had happened that she was processing before she allowed herself to react to it. She set her basket on the table. She pulled off her coat. She stood for a moment with her back to the room. "Mara," Caleb said. She turned around. Her face was controlled, but underneath the control was something that, in a less composed woman, would have been anger. In Mara, it presented as a kind of compressed, highly specific alertness, like a blade that had been properly sharpened. "Gideon Voss came to the trading post today," she said. "I've heard the name." "He introduced himself." She sat down at the table and folded her hands on its surface, a gesture he'd come to recognize as the physical version of her collecting herself. "He was extremely polite. He said he'd heard I had a fine piece of property and that he'd be very interested in discussing a purchase if I was ever of a mind to consider it." What did you say?
I said I wasn't. She paused. He said he understood, and that the offer would remain open, and that he hoped we'd have occasion to speak further.
Another pause, this one carrying more weight. Then he looked at me in a particular way and said that he'd heard I was managing quite a full household these days, and that he hoped I wasn't finding it. She stopped. He said, burdensome. The word landed in the room with the specific gravity Voss had clearly intended it to carry. Caleb was quiet for a moment.
He used that word deliberately.
Of course he did. Mara's voice was even.
He wanted me to know that he knows about you and the children being here. And he wanted me to know that he considers it a vulnerability, something that makes me look,
she searched for the word,
reduced in people's estimation.
Caleb felt something tighten in his chest that was not entirely on his own behalf.
He thinks that if you're already the subject of gossip, you'll be more likely to sell, get out cleanly before the talk gets worse. That's my read, she said.
Is it working? She looked at him across the table with the direct, unhurried steadiness that was the essential quality of her character.
No, she said.
He believed her. He also understood, looking at her face, that the fact of Voss's approach had unsettled her, not because she doubted herself, but because she recognized it as the beginning of something, not the end. Men like Gideon Voss didn't make one polite approach and then move on when rebuffed. They had patience and resources, and the willingness to apply pressure through channels that were not always obvious until the pressure was already on. Over the following 2 weeks, that pressure began to build in ways both subtle and overt. The talk in the settlement shifted, not dramatically, these things never were dramatic at first, but noticeably. The looks when Mara came to the trading post, the way certain women turned away in conversation, the particular quality of silence that followed when she entered a room. Amos Fletcher, who had closed his door on Caleb and his children that frozen December morning, now found occasion to mention, loudly and in public spaces, his concerns about the moral character of the settlement and whether certain arrangements were setting the proper example for young people. It was Margaret Aldrich who told Mara directly. She pulled her aside after a Sunday gathering and said, quietly but firmly, "You should know what's being said. Voss has been talking. He's made it known that he's concerned about your situation. He's framing it as worry for your reputation, but everyone knows what he's really doing." "What is he really doing?" Mara asked, though she already knew. "Making you uncomfortable enough to want to leave. Making the settlement uncomfortable enough with you that when you do sell and go, everyone will think it's for the best." That night, Mara told Caleb all of it. She recounted it without drama, just the facts, delivered in her customary direct manner. But he could see what it was costing her. Not the gossip itself. She'd told him once that she'd long since stopped caring what most of these people thought. But the calculated nature of it. The way Voss was weaponizing the town's small-mindedness against her. "He's not going to stop," Caleb said. "No," she agreed. "He's going to escalate. Make the social pressure worse. See if that moves me." "Mara," he waited until she looked at him directly, "I want you to know that I understand this situation has costs for you that it doesn't have for me. The gossip, the pressure, those land on you differently than they land on me. If my being here is making any of this harder—" "Stop," she said. "I'm saying if it would be better for you—" "Caleb." Her voice was quiet but absolute. "I made my choice with full knowledge of what it would cost.
I don't need you to offer to undo it. She held his eyes.
What I need is for you to trust that I know my own mind. He was quiet.
Then I trust your mind.
Good, she said. Then let's talk about how we're going to deal with Gideon Voss.
But before they could formulate any strategy, Voss made his next move, and it was more direct than either of them had anticipated. It came on a cold afternoon in mid-February. Caleb was at his own land, walking the timber stands and planning the spring work, when he saw riders approaching. 3 of them, Voss in the center, flanked by 2 men Caleb didn't recognize. Large men, the kind hired for presence rather than conversation. Voss dismounted with the easy confidence of a man on solid ground. "Mr. Mercer," he said, extending a hand. "Gideon Voss. I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Caleb didn't take the hand. "What can I do for you, Mr. Voss?" "Direct. I appreciate that." Voss withdrew his hand without apparent offense. "I wanted to speak with you about Mrs. Whitlock's property."
I understand you've been staying there since your unfortunate incident in December.
That's right. Then you're aware of the property's particulars, its boundaries, its resources. Voss gestured around them. Fine land, water access, timber, strategic position. Mrs. Whitlock has something valuable, and I'm prepared to pay well for it. She's already told you no. She has, which is why I'm speaking to you. Voss's smile didn't reach his eyes. I understand you're a practical man, Mr. Mercer. A man who's had some hard luck, and who might appreciate an opportunity to improve his situation. I'm prepared to offer you a finder's fee. Let's call it a gratitude payment, if you can help Mrs. Whitlock see reason about my offer. The 2 men behind Voss shifted slightly, not threatening exactly, just present, just reminding Caleb that this conversation was happening on Voss's terms. You want me to convince her to sell, Caleb said.
I want you to help her understand that holding on to that land serves no purpose except stubbornness. She's a widow living alone. She's not alone, Caleb said. Forgive me. A widow living with a man who is not her husband and his 2 children in what some might call compromising circumstances. Voss's smile widened fractionally. That's the kind of arrangement that generates talk, Mr. Mercer. The kind of talk that makes life in a small settlement very difficult. Now, if she were to sell, take a fair price, and relocate somewhere her reputation hadn't been complicated, well, that would be better for everyone, wouldn't it? Here, in this moment, was the question that had been building since December, since the 11 closed doors, since the 12th door opened. What do we owe the people who save us? Caleb stood on his own land, or what had been his land, what would be his land again if he could rebuild, and looked at Gideon Voss. At this man who dealt in property and pressure, who understood the mathematics of exploitation, who knew how to find the weak point in any situation and apply force until something gave. And Caleb understood with absolute clarity that Voss had misidentified the weak point. He thought Caleb was it. He thought a man in Caleb's position, homeless, dependent, grateful, could be leveraged, could be bought or intimidated into serving Voss's purposes. He'd made a fundamental miscalculation. Get off my land, Caleb said. Voss's smile faded. I'm offering you money, Mr. Mercer. Real money. Enough to rebuild. Enough to establish yourself somewhere. All I'm asking, I heard what you're asking, and I'm telling you no. Mara Whitlock's property is hers. Her decisions are hers.
And if you come near her with this again, if you send your men near her, if you breathe another word of gossip about her in that settlement, you and I are going to have a different kind of conversation."
One of the men behind Voss moved forward half a step. Caleb didn't move, just held the man's eyes until he stopped. Voss studied Caleb for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd suspected. "I see how it is," he said. "You've developed feelings. How touching." He moved toward his horse. "Enjoy your borrowed home while it lasts, Mr. Mercer. Winter ends, and when it does, you'll need to figure out where you actually belong." They rode away, leaving Caleb standing in the snow on land that was his, but wasn't, planning a future that depended entirely on the continued generosity of a woman he had no right to and every reason to love. Black Hollow held loose community gatherings about once a month through winter, informal assemblies at the trading post where the settlement's residents discussed shared matters: road maintenance, predator problems, collective grain shortages, the occasional dispute that needed mediation. They were not formal institutions, had no legal weight, and were attended with varying degrees of investment depending on what was on the table. But they were the closest thing the settlement had to a common space, and their social significance was therefore considerable. Mara went because she always went. Caleb went because Mara said he should, and he trusted her read of the situation. They left the children with clear instructions and walked to the trading post through the February cold without discussing what might happen, because naming it felt like inviting it. The meeting had the ordinary texture of such gatherings, the trading post main room warm and close with bodies, the smell of wood smoke and damp wool, the background noise of a dozen conversations being held simultaneously at different volumes. Amos Fletcher presided in the loose, self-appointed way of a man who has decided through sheer persistence that his house is the community's house. There was discussion of the North Road, which had drifted badly. There was a complaint about a fence line. There were the usual seasonal concerns. And then, about 40 minutes in, Gideon Voss spoke. He did it well. Caleb had to give him that. He didn't attack directly. He didn't name names. He approached it from the side, in the manner of a man raising a general community concern, his voice warm and reasonable, his manner that of someone reluctantly forced to address an awkward subject by his sense of civic responsibility. "There's been some talk," he said to the room at large, "about certain arrangements in the settlement that decent folks are finding concerning. I won't name particulars, but in a community that depends on its reputation for mutual trust, it seems reasonable to ask whether certain situations ought to be addressed before they become a source of lasting damage to the settlement's character." The room shifted, not dramatically. No one spoke. No one moved with any particular purpose. But Caleb felt the shift, the collective reorientation of attention, the whole room turning without turning its head in the direction of him and Mara. Mara stood about 3 feet to his left. He felt her go still, not with surprise or distress, but with the quality of stillness that precedes action. He'd seen it before, in the moment before she took a difficult shot. She was preparing. 2 or 3 people in the room made the particular kind of throat-clearing non-comment that means, "I have opinions about this, but won't be the first to say them aloud." Amos Fletcher looked at his hands. The Aldrich man looked at the floor. It was Margaret Aldrich, the woman who had warned Mara about the gossip, who spoke first. "I don't see that it's any of the settlement's business how Mara Whitlock runs her household," Margaret said in the quiet but carrying voice of a woman who had made up her mind. "Nobody said it was,"
Voss said pleasantly.
You implied it, Margaret said. I raised a general. You raised a specific implication with deliberately vague language, Mara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but the room went quiet. Not because she'd raised it, but because the quality of it, steady, precise, carrying the particular authority of a person who knows exactly what they're going to say and has already decided not to soften it, commanded the silence. Mr. Voss, she said, turning to look at him directly, you've come to my property twice with a purchase offer I didn't request. Both times I said no. Now you're standing in a public room, implying that my personal arrangements are a matter of community concern. And I'd like to be direct about what I think that is. Voss's pleasant face made a small adjustment. Not quite a smile, not quite its absence. It's leverage, Mara said. You think that if you embarrass me publicly, you'll weaken my position. You think that a woman who's already being talked about will decide that selling is easier than fighting. She looked around the room, unhurried, meeting eyes. So I want to be clear for everyone in this room. My land is not for sale. Not to Mr. Voss, not to his consortium, not at any price he's likely to name. My decision on that has nothing to do with what anyone in this settlement thinks of my household arrangements. She paused. And I'll say one more thing. Her voice didn't rise, but something in its timbre shifted. Deeper, more absolute. A man came to this settlement last month with his children after losing everything in a fire. He went to every house in Black Hollow asking for help. 11 houses. Not one of you opened your door. She let that sit for a moment. I did. And I would do it again tomorrow. And I don't require anyone's approval for it. Not then, and not now. If that's the arrangement some people find concerning, I'd suggest that what concerns you isn't the arrangement itself. It's the fact that it shows what this settlement chose when it mattered. The room was completely still. Voss opened his mouth to speak, but Mara cut him off. I'm finished talking to you, she said. Not with heat, not with drama. The way you close a door that you don't intend to open again. She turned back to the front of the room. Amos Fletcher was looking at his hands again. Caleb was looking at Mara. He had known in the abstract that she was remarkable. He had been understanding it more specifically over the weeks. But watching her stand in the center of that room, a woman who had every reason to be defensive, every reason to be shaken, a woman who had just been publicly maneuvered into a humiliating position by a practiced and well-resourced opponent, and speak with that particular clear, unadorned, unfrightened honesty, was something different, not abstract at all. Margaret Aldrich spoke up again, her voice stronger now. I agree with Mara. What happened in December was a disgrace. We should be ashamed we made that family beg for help. Another voice from the back, Thomas Henderson's father. My boy told me about the easement Mrs. Whitlock secured. She could have used that against us when Voss came with his offer. She didn't. That speaks to character. A third voice, then a fourth. Not everyone, not even most, but enough that the room's temperature changed. Enough that when Voss looked around, he saw something he hadn't anticipated. Resistance. But Caleb also saw what Mara saw. Voss wasn't backing down. He was recalibrating. Men like Voss didn't surrender in public forums. They retreated, regrouped, and came back harder. After the meeting, walking home through the dark and the cold, neither of them said anything for a long while. Their breath made clouds in the still air. The snow was blue-white under the moon.
"That was," Caleb started. "It needed saying," Mara said.
"I know. I'm not arguing with it." He paused. "I just want you to know you said things in there that you didn't have to say. About the 11 doors. That cost you something."
"It was true. Truth has costs." She walked for a few steps without answering. Then, "I'm tired of watching people pretend that cruelty is just caution," she said. "I'm tired of sitting in rooms with people who shut their doors on a man's children and then look at the person who opened hers as if she's the problem." Her voice was still even, but underneath it something was moving, something that had been compressed for a long time and had finally found a sentence wide enough to move through. "I would rather be the problem they're talking about than the caution they're hiding behind." Caleb walked beside her and felt the thing that had been accumulating in him for weeks shift and settle into something recognizable.
Something that had a name, even if he wasn't ready yet to say it out loud. But Voss wasn't finished. Caleb understood that 3 days later when he came back from checking his timber stands to find Mara standing in the cabin doorway, her face pale in a way he'd never seen before. "What happened?" he said, already moving toward her. "Voss sent men to the Henderson place. Told them he knows about some debts they haven't disclosed. Old debts, from before they came to Wyoming. He said if they don't cooperate with his land acquisition, he'll make sure those debts find them." "Can he do that?" "He can if he has the connections he claims to have." Mara's voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "The Hendersons are terrified. If they sell to him, it gives him leverage over the water rights that feed this property. If he controls the water—" "He controls everything," Caleb finished. They stood in the doorway together, watching the sun set over land that was hers, but might not be for long. And Caleb made a decision. "I'm going to talk to the Hendersons," he said. "Caleb, not to convince them of anything, just to let them know they're not alone in this. That if Voss comes at them, he's coming at all of us." He looked at her. "We don't let him divide us. That's how men like him win." Mara studied his face for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. But we're doing this together. That's what he doesn't understand. That's what none of them understand." She reached out and took his hand, the first time she'd done so deliberately, consciously, with full knowledge of what the gesture meant. "We're not alone anymore, Caleb. Neither of us. And that makes us stronger than he thinks." Her hand in his was warm and rough with work, and absolutely steady. In the cabin behind them, they could hear Noah laughing at something Lila had said. The ordinary sound of children who felt safe, who had a home, who had 2 adults standing between them and the world's cruelties. "Together, then," Caleb said. "Together," Mara agreed. And in that moment, facing down a threat that could take everything they'd built, they both understood what had been growing between them all winter, what had started with an open door and become something neither of them had planned for, but both of them needed. They understood it. They just hadn't said it yet. The Henderson family didn't sell. It was a near thing. For 3 days they wrestled with the decision. 3 days during which Caleb and Mara sat with them each evening, not pressuring, not pleading, just present, reminding them that they weren't alone, that whatever Voss threatened, they'd face it together. On the 3rd day, John Henderson looked at his wife, then at Caleb and Mara, and said, "We're staying. Let him come with his threats. We're not giving him our land." Word spread through the settlement, and something shifted. Not dramatically, these things never are dramatic, but definitely. Other families who had been wavering, who had been listening to Voss's smooth assurances and calculated pressure, began to reconsider. Margaret Aldrich made it known that anyone who sold to Voss was, in her estimation, choosing money over community. The feed store owners stopped extending credit to Voss's account. It wasn't a revolution. It was just enough resistance that Voss's easy path forward became complicated. And men like Voss don't stay where the path is complicated. They go where it's easy. By the first week of March, he was gone. His fine wagon and his hired men rolled out of Black Hollow on a gray morning, heading north toward other opportunities, other vulnerable properties, other people he could leverage. Mara watched him go from the cabin window. "It's not over," she said. "Men like him don't forget. They just wait." "Maybe," Caleb said, standing beside her. "But we'll be ready if he comes back. We know what we're dealing with now." The snow was beginning to melt, not the dramatic thaw of late spring, but the tentative, gradual retreat of winter acknowledging that its time was ending. Water ran in thin rivulets down the south-facing slopes. The creek swelled with snowmelt. The air carried the first hint of something that wasn't quite warmth, but wasn't quite cold anymore. Spring was coming. And with it, the question they'd both been avoiding. It was Lila who forced it into the open, in the way that children do when adults are being too careful with each other. "Papa," she said one evening after supper, with the direct, unsentimental clarity that was entirely her own, "are we going to build a new house? Or are we staying here?" The question hung in the air. Noah looked up from his carving. Mara's hands went still on her quilting. Caleb looked at his daughter, at this girl who had watched her home burn, who had stood in the snow outside 11 closed doors, who had learned to be strong because she'd had no choice. She deserved an honest answer. "I don't know yet," he said. "That depends on things we haven't talked about." "What things?" Noah asked. Caleb looked at Mara. She was watching him with those direct, steady eyes, not helping, not hindering, just waiting to see what he would say. "Things that grown folks need to discuss first," he said. "But I promise you both, whatever we decide together, all of us." Lila nodded, satisfied with that. "Good, because I don't want to leave." "Me neither," Noah said. "General would miss me." "General would survive," Mara said, with the dry precision that meant she was hiding something softer underneath. "But yes, I think she would miss you." That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb and Mara sat at the table. The fire was banked low, the cabin was quiet. Outside they could hear the drip of snowmelt from the roof, the sound of winter losing its grip. "I need to say something," Caleb began. "I know," Mara said. "I've been waiting." "For how long?" "Since February, maybe longer." She set down the cup she'd been holding. "Say what you need to say, Caleb." He'd been composing this for weeks, trying to find the right words, the honest words, the words that would encompass everything he felt without being too much or too little. In the end, he just said it plainly.
I love you, Mara. I love who you are. Not what you've done for us, though that's part of it.
Not the shelter you gave us, though I'll be grateful for that until the day I die. I love the person you are every day, the way your mind works, the way you treat people, the way you don't waste anything, including the truth. I've been watching you for 4 months, and there's nothing about what I see that I want to look away from. He paused. I want to build a life with you, not because I'm grateful, not because I need a place to live, but because when I think about the future, when I try to imagine what I want the next 20 or 30 years to look like, you're in every single version of it. You and my children, and the life we could build together, if you'll have us. Mara was very still. In the lamplight he could see her face, that face he'd learned over the winter, that face that had opened a door when every other door closed. I told you once, she said quietly, to be here. You did. That wasn't accidental, she said. I know it wasn't. She reached across the table and took his hand, not with sentimentality, not with performance, but with the same directness and precision she brought to everything, a decision made and held. I don't need pretty words, Caleb Mercer. I never have. What I need is to know if you mean this. If when you say the next 20 or 30 years, you understand what that means. The hard winters and the hard work, and the days when we'll disagree and the days when it will be difficult. All of it. I mean all of it, he said. Every day, every version, all of it. She studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, decisively. Then yes, she said. Build your life with me. Build our life. Let's stop pretending this is temporary and start treating it like what it is. Permanent. Real. Ours. Caleb felt something in his chest that had been clenched since the fire, since before the fire, since Eleanor died, since he'd become a man alone with 2 children and the weight of the world on his shoulders. Finally, release. I don't have a ring, he said. I don't have anything to offer you, except work and loyalty and the promise that I'll stand beside you through whatever comes. That's everything I want, Mara said simply. The rest is just decoration. They sat there in the lamplight, hands joined across the worn wood of the table, and let the future, which had been formless for so long, begin to take its shape. Outside, the snow continued its slow retreat. The creek ran higher. The aspens at the tree line showed the first hint of green at their tips. Winter was ending, and with its ending came the understanding that what they'd built in that small cabin over those hard months wasn't just survival. It was home. It was family. It was the particular, irreplaceable thing that happens when people choose each other not out of necessity, but out of recognition. Out of the understanding that this person, this specific person, is worth building a life around. They would marry in April, when Samuel Pruitt's associate came through on his circuit. They would build a new cabin on Caleb's land, large enough for 4 people and whatever future might come. They would keep Mara's original cabin standing, maintained and ready for whoever needed it next. But all of that was later. In this moment, they were just 2 people sitting in firelight, holding hands across a table, making promises with their silence that were more binding than any vow. Thank you Caleb said, "for opening the door." Mara smiled, that rare, real smile that she gave so sparingly it felt like a gift every time. "Thank you for knocking," she said.
Years later, when Noah was grown and had his own property east of the settlement, he would sometimes be asked about how his family had come together. He told it straightforwardly. The fire, the walk through the snow, the 11 closed doors, and the 12th door that opened. She didn't think of herself as doing something remarkable, Noah would say. She thought she was just opening a door. She didn't know it was the door that everything else came through. He would pause in the same place every time. But that's what doors do, when someone has the nerve to open them. The open house in the tree line stood for decades. It outlasted Voss's consortium. It outlasted the original settlement itself. And it saved more lives than anyone ever counted, because some gifts are too large to measure. They just keep giving, door after door, winter after winter, one open hand reaching toward another in the snow. If this story moved you, if you felt something when that 12th door opened, then you understand why these stories matter. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's standing in the cold, someone who's knocked on too many doors, someone who's wondering if there's still kindness left in the world. There is. It lives in the moments we choose each other, in the doors we open, in the families we build not from blood, but from choice. Thank you for listening, and remember, you could be someone's 12th door. You could be the moment everything changes. All you have to do is open it.